Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Thursday, February 13th, 2025. On Thursdays, we consider knowledge and science. Today in particular, we're going to be looking at how we might evaluate truth claims in the public sphere. So it's a vlog about knowledge, but it's a vlog that builds upon yesterday's, wherein I discussed a rather difficult issue. Specifically, that while we aspire to live lives of integrity, and if confronted with dishonesty, we'd like to be able to forgive people. There are tremendous health and social benefits to forgiveness. But I was talking specifically yesterday about two broad areas where we might find it difficult to forgive others. If you're dealing with people who constantly lie or gaslight, and if you're dealing with people who engage in chronic forms of abusive behavior, or who perhaps strive to humiliate you publicly. But what does any of that have to do with knowledge and science? I want to suggest everything. That it's quite simple, actually. And so I'm going to pose a couple of questions for you. First, do you agree that chronic dishonesty, gaslighting, abuse, public humiliation, that these are unhealthy for you in your personal relationships? Surely we can all agree that we cannot build healthy relationships with others, certainly in our personal lives, if they're constantly lying, deceiving, gaslighting, abusing, or humiliating us. And so then that leads to a second question. Why would we maintain or engage with others in different realms in similar ways? So if dishonesty isn't acceptable in our personal relationships, would we somehow contend that it's acceptable in the public sphere? Again, I'm not talking about people who simply express different opinions or with whom we have philosophical disagreements. That's a natural part of human social life. I'm talking about people who actively act in dishonest or deceptive ways, or who lie or gaslight or abuse and humiliate us on a regular basis. So let me demonstrate the distinction then by just looking at the difference specifically between an opinion, somebody who simply has a different opinion than we do, versus somebody who is actively being dishonest. Okay? So again, I'm going to contrast the difference between having a difference in opinion versus somebody who's responding in a fundamentally dishonest way. All right? And so consider two types of arguments that you might hear with respect to people's views of universal health care or public versus private health care. Okay? So person one says something along the lines of, well, I think health care should be private because I don't like the idea of my tax dollars funding a public system. If everyone gets universal access to health care, then that means that I'll have to pay for people even if they smoked all their lives or they don't take care of themselves. I don't like that. As for myself, I eat well, I exercise, I take care of myself. And so personally, I'd rather just pay for my own insurance. I'd rather just use the healthcare system only when I really needed it. Besides, if I really want some good healthcare, I'm going to pay for it. I'd like to be able to walk into a private facility and not have to wait in line. Or if I needed to, I'd like to be able to just go down to the corner and get an MRI done this afternoon on my knee, if I like. That's the kind of healthcare system that I prefer. Sure, I get it. Some people are not going to have the same access or the same quality of care. But no one said life's fair and that everyone should get the exact same things in life. I mean, if I've worked hard and done well in life, that means I'm probably going to be able to afford a better car, for example. And I'll be able to purchase better health care, or a private nurse, for example, to look after me down the road. I just don't want to pay for other people's health care. I don't think of health care as somehow a fundamental human right. That's just my opinion. Okay, so that's person one. And let me be clear. This is perhaps an individual's heartfelt opinion, right? And they're entitled to that opinion. And by the way, in the main, to the extent that they were referencing anything factual in nature, they're largely correct. Right? That's not their main focus, but they're not throwing out statistics willy-nilly or, cherry picking from evidence and, somehow claiming that the private system is way cheaper or whatever. They do mention that with money, they acknowledge that they could probably get quicker access and better health care. And that's probably true, right? I may disagree philosophically with the person, or I might ask them to reconsider or think about alternative perspectives. But they're not being a bad actor. They're not lying or abusing me. They're simply expressing their opinions, their preferences, their general philosophy. And that's totally fair and reasonable, even if I might disagree. But then consider person number two. They say something like this. Well, I think healthcare should be private because universal healthcare or single-payer systems, public health systems, they're failing all over the world. Look at a place like Canada that has socialized medicine, where people can't even pick their own doctors, where they can't even get basic treatment for common health issues, where people are dying on the streets because they can't get in to see a doctor. You know what's even worse? They have to pay way more in taxes just to keep that bloated system afloat. And they can't even get enough doctors and nurses to work there either because their salaries are so pathetic, especially compared to the U.S. So you're just going to see more and more shortages, people milking that healthcare system dry, and worse health comes overall, over time. Also, since everybody's supposedly covered, then they're not going to take care of themselves. What incentives do they have? They'll just do what they want as freeloaders. And the system's going to be bankrupt in just a few years. So no thanks, Canada. We have the best health care right here in the United States. You keep your socialized medicine. So, now, the problem here with the second person is that everything that they just stated is essentially a lie. Okay? Or at least a grossly misleading statement. A byproduct, in some instances, perhaps, of sheer ignorance, or just statistically indefensible. Now, most Canadians know all of this. They would laugh at the rant that I just went on. Relatively few Americans, however, are deeply familiar with or understand the Canadian healthcare system, or why it's a universal system and how that differs from the American system. And most people, I think, might be shocked or probably wouldn't believe that in almost every study that's ever been done on the subject, the U.S. spends upwards of twice as much money, for example, per person on healthcare as Canadians do. Most recently, 2022 annual cost in Canada were about $6,320 per person, compared to $12,555 in the U.S. Again, almost twice as much. So I'll leave the link in the description below. A couple of links, actually. But my point isn't to somehow, to get you to believe that the Canadian system is better or that the U.S. system is better, or to try to debunk all the myths that I just stated, because that's not the key point. You can still prefer one system over another, but as with many issues, those preferences are typically driven by limited knowledge and by bad actors who have a stake in misinforming or sowing discontent or stoking, public fears, or somehow controlling the narrative to suit their purposes. All right, so, and because we live in a digital age, in the internet age, and there's ready availability of information through social media, it's easier than ever to mislead or deceive. And in fact, I'd be even more blunt. There's a lot of money to be made in lying and deceiving, manipulating, and even humiliating others. While many political and industry leaders do just that, let's keep in mind, too, that there are similar tactics that are used in social media by YouTubers and others, all of whom stand to benefit by creating their own content or catering to specific publics with the intention of exploiting them or profiting from their naivete or gullibility. And furthermore, there's also a great deal of fear, insecurity, and uncertainty that can be exploited for economic and political profit as well. After all, how many folks out there are vulnerable and struggling or living paycheck to paycheck? Actually, we have pretty good research from a recent study, for example, from the Bank of America, no less, that reports that nearly half of U.S. citizens agree, or some would agree, with the statement that I am living from paycheck to paycheck, which, by the way, mirrors the Canadian research on the topic. In fact, about 1/3 report spending at least 90% of their paychecks on the basic necessities. So that doesn't leave much wiggle room for much else. But it's much more than just our economic situations that might stoke our fears and our concerns. According to the Pew Research Center's recent polling, Americans clearly identify inflation as among the top 10 concerns that they have, along with affordable health care, drug addictions, gun violence, violent crime, the state of the country's moral values, illegal immigration, budget deficits, and the quality of public school spending. So these issues concern more than half of all Americans. Again, I'll leave a link in the description below. Are these fears reasonable or founded? And based on what evidence? And for that matter, why are things like climate change and infrastructure repairs much less of a public concern, only expressed by about 1 in 3 or a little over 1 in 3 respondents? Well, of course, these are just people's opinions, their feelings about the issues. So again, we're entitled to highlight, to talk about whatever we want. The point I want to make is that most people, but especially those who are struggling to make ends meet, have to rely on, or they might be only one unexpected emergency away from going bankrupt or what have you. They just don't have the time to be perhaps as informed as they might be, or they don't have the resources to become better informed. And so, in that sense, we all have to trust others. And that's where we can, of course, so readily be misled by charlatans or even predators among us. Now you might say, well, we've always had these kinds of people. There have always been the proverbial snake oil salesman. But are we just going to throw up our hands and say, well, everybody lies, so what's the big deal? But to me, that's a fundamental form of self-deception. Because if it were true that just everybody lies and that's the way that it is, again, we wouldn't be able to forge trusting or healthy relationships. Certainly not in our personal lives, to say nothing of what happens in the public sphere. So instead, we have to rely on a great many people out there who are indeed or might be tempted or even compelled to perpetuate lies. People who are not just individuals, but people who are connected to the institutions and institutions that have these massive platforms that can amplify misinformation, lies, and distortions through governments and especially politicians, as we're all well aware, but also through burgeoning forms of media and especially social media companies and technology companies in the tech industry writ large, all of whom stand to gain to some degree from dishonest rhetoric and behavioral practices. It's much like the classic case of the cigarette manufacturers, who back in the day would dispute or cover up the facts about the research linking cigarette smoking or nicotine to cancer. And then, of course, for that matter, touting patently false claims about the safety or the benignness of cigarette smoking. And so therein lies, I think, our greatest challenge. That's where we all have a responsibility, in my view, to sift through the barrage of lies, the disinformation, misinformation, manipulation, and the efforts to publicly humiliate and shame anyone's, who's considered to be our enemy or the opposition, or those in general who don't accept the deceit that you believe in, quite frankly. And so what's stunning to me is the degree to which integrity has been degraded and devalued in our culture. And so I think the first correction that we need to make, the bulwark against this tsunami of disinformation, would be a reassertion of the importance of integrity, both in our private lives and in the public sphere. Now, I know that's a little bit Pollyannish, a little bit idealistic, to be sure, but I think we have to demand that of ourselves and of our leaders. In other words, just as a lack of integrity in the art of deception undermine our intimate relationships, that happens as well in the institutional spheres, and that in turn produces and reproduces this growing distrust of the media, of the police or the legal system, of the medical and the scientific experts, and of course of the government and politicians. So, what I want to close today's vlog with then would be a discussion, a brief presentation of the top 10 means, or my top 10 list for combating public dishonesty. Okay? So again, this is just my opinion. But I've done some research and I've been looking into the different dynamics involved. And so these are my top 10, and you might suggest some others in the comments below as well. So the first thing that I try to do, or would ask you to do as well, is to try to distinguish between or assess the nature of the information that's being presented. In other words, is it factual information? Are there truth claims that are about the nature of reality and empirically what's observable? Or is it opinion-based information? And if you're not sure, the question is it possible then to empirically evaluate the truthfulness of the person's claim? And if not, then there's a very good chance that they are talking about a value, about an ideological position, or simply about their opinion on a particular matter. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. So again, we need to know whether they're making factual truth claims or opinion claims. A second thing is, what's the main source of their claims? Again, now we're focusing on the nature of truth, or whether people are being honest and so forth. So what's the nature, or what's the source of their claims? And how verifiable is the information that's being presented? So in scientific or scholarly work, that what I do for a living, we have to present, of course, the references, the citations in our written work all the time, or in our public presentations for that matter. So I'm suggesting we should be, or try to be, equally vigilant in terms of demanding to know and being able to consult the sources that other people are using, or at least in relation to the truth claims that they're making. So the bigger and the more substantial the claims, the more important, if you will, I think it's all the more important and all the more crucial that we have that we're able to identify and consult the sources that are involved to be able to validate the claims independently. By the way, in the scientific realm, increasingly what people are doing is they're publishing their research and then publishing the original data as well, or where again, so that the broader research community can also independently evaluate that same information and cross-check or retest the initial claims and so on and so forth. So I'm suggesting that that's an important element that we should be including or asking for in the public sphere as well. I'd like to see, in fact, people literally paid. I'd like to build up an institution, if you will, where people are literally paid just to not just check facts, but also assess the quality and the methodology of the information that's being presented. Again, because you and I, as John and Jane public citizen, probably don't have the time or, in many instances, the skills or energy to be able to do that. So that's a broader recommendation. If we could build that up again, and almost like an independent, like you have an independent judiciary and an independent scientific community, I'd like to see an independent fact-checking community, where again people are not paid on the basis of their ideology, but on the quality of their ability to assess and evaluate the credibility of different sources of information. Okay, so anyway, that goes a little bit further than what I want to talk about. A third element would be how vague or specific are the actors in terms of responding to what's being asked. And do they answer questions directly, or do they do a variety of jujitsu moves and shift the focus, or somehow never really end up answering the question that they've been posed? Or do they answer the question with, even worse, direct forms of lying and misinformation that could actually be checked? And again, we need to fact check as a part of a sort of a built-in corrective measure to combat lying and misinformation. So that should always be present, even if you don't have a separate institution, as I just mentioned. Right? So we literally need to hire more high-quality fact checkers to regularly update us on the quality of what's being presented in the public sphere. In addition, every public leader, statesperson, whomever they are, whatever their field or their expertise, should be assessed and evaluated in terms of their credentials and credibility. What's the source of their knowledge and training? Are they speaking about subjects that are in their wheelhouse, where they are well-trained and knowledgeable? And do they have experience in this regard? And what's their history of speaking publicly on the matter at hand? All else equal, we should trust those who have invested more time and energy in studying the areas of concern. Okay? Additionally, trust more those people who have a more solid reputation for being knowledgeable, for presenting clear information on a subject. And avoid those who have a well-established record of lying or deceiving. Bear in mind that previous behaviors are usually strong indicators of future behaviors. Also, what interests are being served by those who offer their opinions? What do they stand to gain from expressing their views? And can you distinguish between public and private interests, or that which would benefit most people in the general public versus those claims that would seem to be only benefiting a few persons, individuals, particular groups? Relatedly, do they have any obvious or compelling reasons to lie or misinform? And what would be the potential consequences for their lying? Do they acknowledge do the critics acknowledge the degree to which the speaker, the public figures, telling the truth? That would be very powerful, right? In other words, at the very least, do their critics agree that they're using valid sources to make their claims, even if they disagree with the interpretation of the evidence? So again, we may not always agree with respect to interpreting the data, but do their critics nonetheless agree in general in terms of the validity of their sources and the methodologies that are used? And do their critics even vouch for their opposition in that sense? I know there are people that I disagree with in the scientific community, but I also know that they are scientists, they're people with integrity. And generally speaking, we disagree not so much in terms of interpretation of the actual evidence, but maybe in terms of the underlying methodologies, or maybe the limits of particular types of research. But I know that most of the people that I work with, or at least that I encounter in the scientific community, are good faith actors, as I say, even if we disagree with one another. The other point that I wanted to make is that what about personal accountability, and public accountability for that matter? Okay, so does the person ever acknowledge being wrong, or ever accept responsibility for past statements or behaviors that have been shown to be wrong or deceptive? For that matter, do they ever simply use the phrase, "I don't know," in responding to questions? Right? I think it's important to acknowledge the limits of our own knowledge. I'll often say in teaching and in my research context, if I don't know the answer to something, I don't make something up. Okay? I'll say, I don't know the answer to that question. Or, we might qualify the answer in saying, well, here's what I know and here's what we don't know. Or here's something that requires further research. Or we're seeing that the research is mixed in this regard. Again, to the best of our ability, trying to be honest and assume responsibility for our statements and be willing to stand up and say, well, here's what we know, or here's what I know based on the best available evidence. And at the same time, what are the limits of my knowledge, or your knowledge, or anyone's knowledge? Where do we need to be doing more research? Okay? And in fact, I think it's a great idea to also point to others and say, well, here's my area of expertise, so here's what I know best. Not perfectly, not truth with the capital T, but here's what I know best. But here are other people who are working in the area too, and they might be able to answer some of these other questions a little bit better, or they might have other information. Okay? And then finally, are they consistent in their views or contradictory? If they do change their views, and we do, all of us do it from time to time, do they explain why they've changed their views? And then do they present supporting evidence for that change? It's okay to be wrong if we're making good faith efforts to learn and always, to correct our mistakes at the same time. If we have new and credible information, I think it's our responsibility to state that. I think it's crucial to report on the newest information. So, for example, I've been teaching a course on advanced statistics at my university at the undergraduate level, and we've been using data from a large-scale national health study in Canada, over 100,000 participants. And so I thought going in to teaching the course and doing a specific unit on certain types of statistical analyses, I thought that women would, on average, self-report higher levels of health than men, based on the fact that women do, statistically speaking, live longer than men by about 3 to 4 years in Canada and many other places too. So, but when I looked at the data, I was actually quite surprised. I was wrong. And I learned that the self-reported rates, or the self-reported health, I should say, for men and women were identical, based on the measures that they used. There was literally no difference in average levels of self-reported health, no differences in the standard deviations for that matter. So at least in that regard, I looked at the evidence and said, that's new to me. By the way, that's part of why I love the scientific process. I love learning. I do have hypotheses, ideas, theories, and sometimes I'm wrong. or partly wrong. And the great thing about science is the extent to which we do have these built-in corrective mechanisms. And in a sense, I'm suggesting that that's what we need to do more generally and apply these corrections to the public sphere, at least wherever possible. Okay? So in effect, I'm saying, live and learn. Be skeptical at all times, but try to avoid being cynical. Understand and learn about the pressures that are at play here, right? And that would enhance or detract from the credibility of the public figures and their statements. Hold them accountable. Hold ourselves accountable. Not because they're on my team or on the opposition's team, but because public statements and truth-telling are absolutely essential. They benefit everyone. Or conversely, they potentially hurt large swaths of people, okay? Just like lying to people in our private lives does, or might do, or typically does, I should say. Okay, so tomorrow then, we'll look at one more piece of the puzzle in our next installment on human behavior and justification. And that is why we allow ourselves then to fall for the con men, for the alleged strong men for that matter, or those who lie or cheat or deceive on behalf of themselves and their tribes. And finally then, how can we free ourselves from the grip of those who would lead us astray and keep us imprisoned in darkness? Again, that's for tomorrow. Until then, and as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And I hope to see you tomorrow.